All right. I'm back. I'm energized. Got a little more energy if I need it, if I'm willing to let you listen to my smacking lips on the stream. And we're ready to go. We're ready to move on. So, in the last segment, we got the loading of restaurants from the server working, and we were able to load up. Not adding a dish, adding restaurant. We're able to load up the spaghetti place from the server, mocking out the data. Now we've got another error in our end-to-end test though. When we save the restaurant, we're getting an error here. And this is one of the great things about end-to-end testing and having test-driven development to give you good code coverage. We're getting real errors that are showing us something real that's wrong in the app that we need to fix. And so we can have more confidence moving from one state layer to another. Say you've been using Redux, but then you realize you want to move to Apollo to connect to a GraphQL backend. Or maybe you realize that you don't actually need Redux, and now that React has the context API made public and stable, you want to reach for that instead. So if you've got good test coverage, you can refactor with confidence, and because you know you'll get an error like this when something has changed. So let's look at what this error is and what's going wrong, and to see how we can proceed. So in this case, it says cannot read property name of undefined. And I'm pretty sure I know what this means. Previously, when we were saving restaurants, we were just saving the name of it. But now we have a whole object coming back from the server. So if we're just saving a name, now all of a sudden our Redux store has some objects and then one plain string. Let's confirm that just by loading the page. We can kind of visualize that to sort of follow it. So here I'm actually connecting to the real backend and getting a lot of stuff, including lots and lots of sushi places. And let's pull up our Redux store. We see that our restaurants has a bunch of stuff there. And then I add a new restaurant. Add restaurant. Well, let's see here. State. Yeah, check it out. So restaurants has one string and then a bunch of objects. So that's a problem. So we need to change the way adding works. And I suppose we could get it passing just by having it change the data format. So let's try that. If we want to take the test-driven development approach of only changing enough to get past the current test, then let's do that. And then we can write a test that's going to confirm that's going to go over to the server. So let me think here. This would be a change in the dishes reducer. Yeah. Let's do it. Let's make a change to the dishes reducer because we already have test coverage for it. We're going to need to change this unit test because the way, well, maybe not. Maybe we won't. So do I want to add the dish? When I add the dish, do I want it to be no, that's the dish. Sorry, this is dishes reducer. This is totally different. Okay, so I don't have a test right now for the add restaurant action, but we should do that because we can test it out. I'm just going back and forth. I'm so conflicted here because like how much do I want to do at once? Let's just make this change directly under the end-to-end test, and then we'll write out the unit test once we're ready to go to driving out the asynchronously and hitting the server. Okay, so we have the restaurant action to add restaurant. I mean, we want to add, I think we're going to want the structuring of things to happen in here. So we can say, instead of this, we're going to say const restaurant. So we need now to make an object in the format that JSON API is going to follow. We type restaurants. We're not going to have an ID. That's okay. Actually, that might still blow up. We'll find out. But attributes name. So the restaurant has a name. And then we're going to pass this restaurant to the reducer instead. So let's do that. And then let's go into the reducer. And we add restaurant in here. This should remove the last vestige of us referring to restaurant names directly. It looks like some unit test is failing. No, maybe it's passing. I'm not sure. But let's run the end-to-end test here to see if this fixes it for us. And actually, I just want to go to the restaurant one. Adding a restaurant. So check this out. From the end-to-end test standpoint, it's passing now. We've got spaghetti place and sushi place both showing up in here. So this is great. So this is like a small step. So I want to do an actual commit for the small step. And this is going to be fix add restaurant. Let's say change add restaurant to to store object instead of just name. This is now going to add a full restaurant object to there. So from an end-to-end standpoint, this is passing now. Sushi place is showing up. But are we good to go? Well, not really. Let's try it in the real application. Let's see. So we've got these restaurants, restaurant from server. Let's say stream restaurant. We save and it shows up there. When we reload the page, stream restaurant is gone. And that's because we haven't updated it to actually save that data to the server. So what can we do at the end-to-end level to test this? I suppose we could have the end-to-end test reload the page like we just did here and make sure it still shows up. But that's not usually the level I have end-to-end tests right at. Like reloading the page feels like something outside of the concern of the end-to-end test. So I think instead what I'd like to do here is just go down to the unit test. We can unit test that action to make sure it hits things at the server. And so the end-to-end test can just confirm that the record shows up on the screen. I think that's sufficient for me, and I think that gives us good coverage. You might feel otherwise, and that's totally fine. But this is just a different approach that we're going to try right here. So let's go down to the unit test level for the restaurant action, and we're going to unit test and add restaurant action. Restaurant. Load restaurants and add restaurant. And I'm going to kind of take some of this initial structure, just to copy it over. I'm going to call add restaurant. And the way this works is from the rest of your application, the first parameter would come into here. So we pass in restaurant into that. Passing in the name. I like that. I like the name being passed into there. And then we dispatch, and we expect dispatch to have been called with what? What do we want to dispatch here? We want to, and this is actually going to be testing out at a unit testing level what's already happening. We're just going to switch it to be asynchronous like this. We want add restaurant to be dispatched. In fact, it is being dispatched with a full restaurant being passed in. Yeah, so that's good. So now we want to kind of get all these linter errors to be fixed. So we can have a dispatch, a mock function here, add restaurant. I'm going to pull in from here as well as the add restaurant. So we want the add restaurant action as well as action creator. And then we want to create this name object. That's a strange thing we're not being warned about, but restaurant we are being warned about. I wonder what that name is that it's seeing. So const name equals sushi place. Const restaurant. I just want to go ahead and set up at the top level of the file here this structure. I want to say type restaurants. And again, the structure of this data format is not something that you would necessarily have if you're not following JSON API. Just whatever your JSON structure is like, you could do here. Attributes, name is in there. And on my client project, we're using kind of a artisanal, bespoke JSON format like a lot of APIs do, but approaches like this still work. So now we have restaurant and here. So now when we call add restaurant and pass it the name, and then we call dispatch because we're following the redux-thunk approach, then we expect that dispatch will have been called with add restaurant and restaurant is passed in there. So let's see what unit testing warnings we're getting. We're getting add restaurant. After it's been called, the return result is not a function. This is because the add restaurant is still operating in a pre-thunk approach where it's not it's synchronous and just returns the result directly. So let's update that. So I'll put it up here for now. So in here, we want this sort of double arrow function approach, name, and then dispatch. And as we look at this here, now that we've got this test, let's kind of talk through what's happening here. If you haven't used redux-thunk before, or you haven't used this approach in redux-thunk. So we're calling here, add restaurant, call that function, and then the return value, call that function. So the first function call is going to call this arrow function where we pass in the name. Then we're using an arrow function here, and so what it's returning is this whole arrow function there. So this is just like a function call. You could think about this as if this was set up like this, and then we said return this arrow function. So here we can more clearly see we have one arrow function that takes in a name, and then it's got a block that's run, and then in there we return another arrow function there. But when this is all that's happening, that all that's happening in your function is you're returning another function, this chained arrow function style can be really useful. It's something that's common from some kinds of different functional programming, and it works out really well here, especially because with redux-thunk, the fact that it's two functions isn't something that we're too concerned about directly. That's just the format that expects it in. So that's why we have two arrow functions here. So now that that's happening, let's see what happens here. Rerun the test. We save the file and the test automatically runs. This is now saying, oh, I haven't saved both files. So I'll save both files. Now we rerun the test. And now it says .then is not a function. So again, we have the problem here where we are not returning a promise. So let's just do it. Let's just do the minimum possible. Return promise.resolve. And I like the fact that my linter does not warn me about the fact that there's another return statement down here, because that's going to allow me to just do this temporarily, these very small steps to solve one error in the unit test at a time before we move on. So check it out. Now we're back to a similar error we got before. We expect the mock function to have been called with the restaurant here, and then the type was add restaurant, but it was not called. So let's do that. We actually have that happening. We're not yet asserting anything about that's happening to the server, but we have enough information here just to dispatch this directly. So let's dispatch this, because again with redux-thunk we call dispatch within the action creator itself rather than just returning what we want dispatched. And we'll just kind of return promise resolve afterward because that's enough to satisfy the current test failure, and we'll move on from there in the future. So that's now passing. So now our add restaurant is passing, and it should be dispatching add restaurant and returning a resolve promise. So let's see what's happening at the end-to-end test level here. That should actually be about the same. I don't think anything has changed there. Yep, our end-to-end test is still passing. So let's commit these changes. So what have we done? This is update add restaurant to work with thunk. But again, we're at the point where this is still not hitting the server. But now that's something that at a unit test level we can specify. We can say for add restaurant, wow, I'm actually surprised. You know what? I don't think this is actually being run here. No, it was. This is interesting because in Mocha, this actually wouldn't have been run. But we really want this to be in an it block. So in add restaurant, it, how did I phrase this above? It stores a new restaurant in the state. So this is all we've tested so far, is that we're storing the new restaurant in the state. Let's run that, make sure that that's okay. I'm going to add those changes to the last commit because we actually want those in there. So now we want to assert something else about add restaurant. Not only do we want to store the new restaurant in the state, we also want to confirm that it sends the new restaurant to the server. So we now want to make sure that the data goes to the server here. So how can we do that? Well, some of what we can do, we want to move some of this setup up to a before block and then minimize what happens in this test here just to test one thing. If you'll remember from earlier series, we talked about at a component test or unit test level, it's nice to have just one expectation per test here. And that keeps things nice and simple. It keeps our test output nice and descriptive of the different things we want to happen. So let's move all this up there, including dispatching the add restaurant call. Because we return that promise out of this before each block, Jest is going to make sure that that runs before we run any of the other things. And that avoids us having to do a then chain at all. We can actually just do expect, which is kind of nice. But the linter is telling us we need access to dispatch and restaurant outside of that. So let's create a dispatch variable. It'll be let so that we can reassign to it. And then we're going to assign to it there. And the constant name and constant restaurant, we're not going to actually change those in our test. Those can happen outside as well. So before each time, we're going to assign a new mock function to dispatch. And then we're going to run these things. Let's actually just do this refactoring and see. I'm going to cut that and see if it still works. And it does, so that's great. So now that we've refactored to that, we can just add this other additional test here, sends the new restaurant to the server. So what do we want to do? We want to expect, thinking about what we did before. Actually, well, this is going to be a little bit different. Here we didn't have an expectation on API get, but let's do an expectation here. We want to confirm, we need to confirm that API.post, expect it to have been called with, and what are the parameters we need? So post is going to take first the URL, really the path. We want to post to the restaurant's path because that's how REST works, and specifically how JSON API works. And the next argument is going to be the body. And so we can confirm the format of the body. And I guess, I guess actually the format of the body is going to be restaurant as well. So it's going to match that format. I realize now that this test is actually going to change slightly as well. So let's try this. Expect API post to have been called with restaurant. So now we're asserting to ensure that API post has been called. And this is going to fail. I think we may not even have what API is. No, that is a mock. That mock was set up at the top level here. We've mocked API. We've confirmed, we say that we want to make sure that the mock function has been called here, but it was not called. So this could raise a question for you. Back up in this test for load restaurants, we did not assert that API.get was called. We just used that to provide the data that load restaurants needs and comes along here. But down here, we're expecting that API post has been called. So why is that? Well, one reason pragmatically is our test was already passing even though we weren't hitting the external server. And so we needed to set some kind of expectation here to confirm that we're actually posting the API that's saved to the server. But there's another reason, a more theoretical reason. Let me see if I can find a talk by Sandy Metz. Sandy Metz, how to not hate your tests. How to stop hating your test suite. No, that's somebody else. That's Justin Searles. Sandy Metz talk on, here we go. The magic tricks of testing. I was conflating these two talks. I'm sure Justin Searles' talk, How to Stop Hating Your Tests, is wonderful as well. But I was thinking of this talk, RailsConf 2013, Magic Tricks of Testing. So let's not watch the ads there. But in this talk by Sandy, I'm going to post it in the stream. Sandy Metz, Magic Tricks of Testing. Paste the link in case anybody wants it. So in this talk by Sandy, she actually goes through and shows ideas and suggestions for how to do a test suite. And she recommends that for outgoing queries that are just retrieving data, you don't need to test them because the fact that you have that data available is enough of a test to confirm that they're there. That will drive your test to need to stub that out. But for outgoing commands that are actually going to change something, you do want to test for those and assert against those to make sure they happen. And for exactly the reason we're seeing here, that we can't know that was sent correctly to the rest of the application unless we do it here. So, cool. So we've got that error. We expect that the post was called, but it was never called. So now we can go to our implementation to actually implement it. Let's see here. So now we're going to follow a similar approach to load restaurants here. The test has driven us there. We want to call API.post. We're going to go to /restaurants. And then we're going to pass in the restaurant here. So that's going to pass that directly. And so now we don't want to dispatch right away. We could. I think this will actually pass the test. Let's try that. Let's return this promise down here instead of this fake promise that we have. Let's return the promise returned by API here. I think I'm not stubbing it right now, so let's see what the test does for me. So that actually succeeds, but I think that's hitting the real server, which is interesting and unfortunate. But maybe Jess will mock it out. So that actually gets things passing. So let's do this as another small command. So there's a new restaurant in the state. Yeah, so now we've added in confirm or test that we are hitting the server, that we are saving the restaurant to the server. So now we're testing that we're saving the restaurant to the server. So now this is good and we're making progress, but I think we're going to get a warning if we look at the console. So let's try that. We can actually try that in the Cypress test. We'll open the browser console. We'll rerun here. Now we get a warning here. Each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. Oh, we're getting an error to the server that we have an unsupported media type. So let's handle the unsupported media type because that's going to be easier. So let's look at the network here. Unsupported media type. All requests that create or update must use the application vnd.api plus JSON content type. So this is a requirement of JSON API. They require this specific content type, partially so they can give you helpful errors to ensure that you're really intending to connect to JSON API. Part of why I left this until now is that I can never remember exactly how to format this content type. So now I can copy and paste it, so that's very useful. So let's update our application to make this working. We can do this. That's interesting. This is actually hitting the real API, so that's probably not what we want. But we'll use this as an opportunity to actually hit this. So we want a header, content type, application vnd API plus JSON. So let's rerun this test. And we'll see whether we no longer get that error. Well, we do get a bad request. What is that? Required parameter data is missing. So it seems like I'm sending that incorrectly. So that's actually useful. Preview. Yeah, so I'm just sending the record directly. So that's not correct. So I'm actually glad that this is accidentally hitting the server to help us with this. We do not want that to happen. We want to hit the server with an object that has a data property, and the data property is the restaurant. So this is going to fix the error at our end-to-end test level, I think. It does. We have this key error, but let's come back to that in a second because I think our unit test is now breaking. And, you know, this isn't strictly the outside-in TDD approach, but when you're working on a real project, like sometimes things break and you just look into it. All right. Expected the mock function to have been called with this record, but it was called with data there. So our unit test is no longer specifying the right thing. In fact, it wasn't specifying the right thing in the first place. So this is helpful to know. Even though your unit test is passing, when you hit the real server, it may not be working correctly. And that's okay to run across that. So we expect API post to have been called with data restaurant. So the API post should have this data object around it. Whereas when we're dispatching to our internal server here, we should just be passing the restaurant directly. Let's update the test. That's now passing. Our unit test is passing. Our end-to-end test is passing. So let's now commit that change as well. We'll do this first. Fix content type for API posts. And you'll notice we didn't run across that when we were just doing a get from the server. And that's because you don't need the content type refers to the body that's being sent to the server. And for a get, no body is being sent. So that problem it wasn't a problem at all until we started posting data to the server. All right, so now let's post something else. Yeah, now we're fixing the format that we're posting to the server. Fix data format posted to server. All right, so what is happening? Now we have, eventually we're going to need to get this to not actually hit the server. But in the meantime, let's fix this error first to make sure it gets fixed. Each child should have a unique key prop. And so let's see what's happening here in Redux. Let's reload it locally sourced. Now what's happening here is in our state here, all these other records have an ID, but this new restaurant does not have an ID. And this is because what's happening is in our action, we're taking the actual restaurant here and we're saving it into the store instead of getting an ID back from the server. So let's see in the real response if we get an ID back from the server. I just want to make sure about this. Not the get, I want the post. So when we post to the server, the response sends back an ID as well. So we don't want to just send the record that's going out and save that. We want to take the response and store that into Redux. So we're going to wait until we get a response from Redux to store it in. So let's move this dispatch, api.post, and then we're going to do then response object. And again, we're going to kind of work that out. Let's just copy and paste this retrieval. Out of the response object, we'll get a response body. Out of the response body, we'll get a restaurant, a single restaurant. Wait, is that the case? Yep, it's still nested under data. So we'll get a single restaurant, and that restaurant, let's see, I want to give it another name because I prefer not to mask this. Restaurant to save. Let's call this one partial restaurant because it's not a full restaurant record. Partial restaurant is stored up there, but the full restaurant comes back and gets saved in there. So let's see if our end-to-end test, if that works, and if we no longer get that error in the console. Yep, we no longer get that warning in the console. So now, and if we check in our real application, manually testing it, locally sourced, yep, console is fine. And when we look at Redux at our full state, we can see that ID 43, locally sourced, has come back with an ID. But now our unit test is failing. And again, like I suppose I could have test driven that from the outside, but I'm okay with taking this approach. We're just friends here. We're just working together. And this is how I would really code. Is like, oh, right now the end-to-end test is giving me the most value to be able to easily make this change. And now I see that the unit test is failing. That is not a downside for me. I'm really glad that the unit test is failing because it's allowing me to specify the behavior of this action at a lower level. And so let's see what the error is. Expected the mock function to be called with add restaurant, but it was not called. So that's actually surprising to me because I would have expected it to say that the wrong parameter was added. So I'm going to rerun that and just see if that's the case. It was not called. So let's see why that is. Expected API to be called. Expected add restaurant to be called. So dispatch is being called here in the production code. So I'm surprised that the test is not finding that. So let's try rolling this back to actually just say expect dispatch to have been called. And because that's another method we can call on just. Let's see if that passes. Cannot read property then of undefined. Okay, I see. I'm not sure why this errored out in this way. But in our unit test, we are not mocking out the API post. We're checking that API post was called. But we have not set it up to mock a resolve value. So let's do that. API post. So in our before each here, we're going to do API post mock the resolve value that comes back. We're going to return data for the Axios response object, and then data for the response coming out there. And then we have a partial restaurant. So let's do this. Let's rename this as well to partial restaurant. And we'll expect that that was called there. And then let's write out a full restaurant. Equals, and we can just say here, it has everything that partial restaurant has. And you could write out the full thing if you wanted to. But it also has the ID. And was that ID 42? 43. We just missed the meaning of life by one. This time we're going to do 42 for the meaning of life. So the restaurant returned from the server will also have an ID. So resolve value will be a restaurant there. So then we say, yeah, let's see that actually works. API post cannot read property then of undefined. I had API get here. We want API post. The resolve value of post should be all this. And that's now passing. But now we had changed this to say had been called. So we want more detail. I'm not totally sure where that failed. We want dispatch to be called with what? Type add a restaurant. And then it's with the restaurant. The complete restaurant that has the ID, we want that to be saved and dispatched there into the server. And it is in the production code, but we're test after. We're updating the test afterwards to cover that. So that's passing. Let's rerun our end-to-end test. And it's passing as well. Adding a restaurant test is passing. So this is great. So let's walk back through, and I think I'm going to call it a stream here. 4 hours was ambitious. I don't think we've quite gotten there, but this has been good. We've added in our state management. We've added in unit tests and end-to-end tests to connect to it. And so let's look over that together to get a review of what's happened, and then we'll commit the changes, and I think we'll call it a stream at that point. So what do we have? Let's start from the outside. from our adding a restaurant spec. There's one more thing we want to do is we want to stub out the post that happens to the server because we don't want to actually be hitting the server anymore. So I'll commit the changes we have here. So what's happening in our add restaurant action? It's going from just synchronously, well, no, we already had it posting. But what we're having is posting, and then we're storing the updated restaurant into the store. So that goes there. And then in our unit test of the action, we check for the partial restaurant versus the full restaurant. We're mocking out the value that's being posted, and then we're confirming that the partial restaurant was sent to the API post, and then but the full restaurant is in fact being stored in Redux. Store response restaurant from API in Redux. Okay, so the last thing we want to do in the end-to-end test is we want to stub out the post as well. And I think we might just be able to say, well, actually, we are going to need to give it response data. Let's see it actually breaking to make sure it works. So we want to be able to post to the URL restaurants. And there might be a way in Cypress. Again, this is my first time mocking out API responses from Cypress because I haven't gotten to use it on a production project yet. There might be a way in Cypress to say, hey, never talk to the production server. I don't want to at all. I know Cypress likes to be flexible, so they like you to have the option of hitting the server for some requests, but not for others. But in our case, the philosophy I'm taking right now, at least, I'd like to never hit the production server. Maybe I'll look into that and have that ready for the next stream. So let's say we post to the server and hit the restaurants. Let's say we don't give it any response data. Let's see what happens. So that actually, well, it says it succeeds, but here it says cannot read property stop of null. That's interesting. I'm actually surprised. Let me close this and restart this. I would have thought that our app would have errored out because we're not getting a response back. Oh, you know what? Maybe it's because maybe it is really hitting the server and getting a real response back. So let's check that out in the console. We're learning together. Post to restaurants is creating it, and it's returning a record. Data type restaurants, attribute sushi place. That's interesting. I'm not quite sure why that's happening. But I do know we want to mock this out. So let's say response, and we can even copy this over from the unit test. It's going to take a little work. So let's copy it over, and here we can just combine it together. You know what? This could actually be tricky. Oh, no, I only want to add one restaurant. When we add multiple dishes, that'll get trickier, and we can do that later. Response. Okay, so response type restaurants. ID is 2, because up above we got ID 1. Here we'll do ID 2. And the name is going to be Sushi Place. I'm sure there's a way to make that dynamic in Cypress, but we're just going to hard code it for now. And in fact, let me do initial restaurant name. Just to make the data flow clearer, added restaurant name. So we're gonna the get will give us back initial restaurant name. The post will give us back added restaurant name. So let's give that a try and see what happens. Can I read property ID of undefined? So something has changed here for sure. Post. What have I done? What would be looking for the ID? Well, let's try this in production or in directly in the browser and see what happens. Oh, but it's not mocked out. Well, let's see if that works. Yeah, that works. So something about what we're doing to fake things out in Cypress is not working here. Let me see. This is all brand new to me, so let's see. Response restaurants 2. We can also console log some stuff here if we want. Okay, here we go. Cannot read property ID of undefined in some restaurant items. So you know what? I'm going to go into the action reducer. Let's log this out. Log out the restaurant when we get back here. And reload. You might still need to use logging sometime, even using test-driven development. Restaurant undefined. Interesting. Okay, so response body data. So let's log out response object instead and see what we get there. Apparently I'm stubbing or mocking this out in the wrong way. So let's find out. Response object. Status 200. Data is type restaurants. So it seems like... Oh, right. I don't have nested def like I was supposed to do that. I forgot once again because JSON API. And so you'd think that just having the simplest possible JSON could be helpful, but I really, really love the JSON API spec, despite the fact that I got something wrong here, because it allows me to be ready for expanding my API in the future for the things that I need. So let's rerun this now. So something's already errored. Cannot read property stop of null. Must have been something temporary. So our test is passing. So I no longer need this log statement. So that's good. That was in here. And let's rerun our unit test to make sure they're passing as well. Unit test passing. Add restaurant test passing. We're good. All right, let's commit that. Make sure you can see that on there. Is that right? Is that high enough? Yeah. Okay. We're going to add it in. So we're changing for the setup initial restaurant. We're passing in the other restaurant name as well. We're taking it in, and we're stubbing it out with a post. And we're changing the name of the initial restaurant name up there. Oh, that's it. So stub out post in end-to-end test. Very nice. Cool. So now we're at the point, now that that's working, we can look over everything we've done so far. Now that we've added a state management layer, now that we've added unit tests and end-to-end tests, and we're actually hitting a real API, we can see how it works. And let's look over our code. Let's look at the production code first. I'm new enough to Redux and redux-thunk that I'd like a little overview of it, and then we'll look at our tests. So the end result of what we've gotten is we have a root reducer here, and right now we have a restaurant reducer and dishes reducer. So the restaurant reducer is here where we can store a restaurant or add restaurants that's going to either replace the array of restaurants we have or add the restaurant onto the list. And so we just do that locally. After we add a restaurant, we save it locally in the cache and show the changes right away. In the actions for our restaurant, because we're doing asynchronous things with redux-thunk, they're more substantial. So load restaurants will actually do a get request through our API, which we've wrapped up, and then it's going to take the restaurants object there and save it into the store, dispatch the store restaurants action. Add restaurant is going to kind of set up our JSON API partial restaurant structure. It's going to post it up to the server, and then it's going to take the response object that comes back with the ID added in, and it's going to dispatch the add restaurant action to save that into Redux structure. You'll see that because we created this API object, all the configuration object goes in there. And I'll show my API token here that I should really invalidate after this stream, and it's there. But in this central place, we've configured our Axios object with the base URL of the server, with the content type that JSON API needs that the rest of our app doesn't need to be concerned with. We just want to centralize that. And with the authorization token that's going to hit the server. Another interesting note is, because we're stubbing this out in the tests, none of this connectivity is tested. We don't know that we're hitting the right URL. We don't know that we're sending the right JSON API format or if we're authorized. And that's okay. This is part of the zone of the kind of interfacing with the dirty outside world that's best to avoid or to minimize in our end-to-end test. And that keeps our tests nice and stable and not depending on whether this external API is up or not. So that's our production code. We should look at how it's wired up as well. So in the restaurant list page, we have a connect component. We pull in the load restaurants and add restaurant action creators. We call load restaurants when the component did mount, and we call add restaurants when we're handling the add restaurant here. And our form didn't need to change, so it's just our restaurant list page that's handling that. Down at the bottom, we map the state to props to kind of pull in the restaurants, and we map dispatch to props to be able to dispatch these two different action creators, and we're all wired up and good to go. So that's our production code. Now let's look at our tests. let's look at our test outside in. We'll look at the outside first. So in our adding a restaurant test, you know what? I'm going to actually look at the diff here. So let's push up this PR and let's look at the diff that happened in our tests. So we'll push up this branch to GitHub. That's being pushed up, and that's good to go. And then we'll do hub pull request. Say add state management and API connectivity. So create that pull request, and now let's do hub open. This GitHub command line tools is really useful. I highly recommend it if you haven't installed it yet. All right, so we're looking at all our changes here. Looking at files changed, and let's go down to adding a dish spec. So what's happened here? We were already adding a restaurant, going to the restaurant page, confirming the modal isn't shown. Oh no, that's adding a dish. Let's come back to that in a second. Let's look at adding a restaurant first. So adding a restaurant, we were already doing all these steps to confirm that we can add a restaurant correctly. What have we done? We've set up an initial restaurant, and we've confirmed that the restaurants are displayed from the server at the start. So this confirms we're actually hitting the real server. We're also stubbing out the server connection so that we can see that when we get restaurants, this is what's returned. And when we're posting to restaurants, this is what is returned as well. And we're not, notice in the end-to-end test, we're not confirming that we've posted the restaurant. We're just making sure that that works. That confirmation happens at the unit test level. Then at the add dish level, we added some code to the add dish spec as well to make sure that when we left a page and came back to it, that the dish was still there, and to confirm the dishes were stored to the restaurant. And as you'll recall, that bit of the test is what we needed to be able to drive us to the point of having state management. We'll look at the unit test in a second here. Let's do that. Where was that? Yeah, notice we didn't unit test the API file at all either. That was just configuring Axios. Like that is just using Axios. And really, once we're actually manually testing and connecting to a server, that's how we can confirm that the API file is working. It's yet another reason that I don't like to have 100% test coverage or look at test coverage metrics at all when I'm doing test-driven development, because if I'm test driving it, we focus on the quality of the tests and what we want covered as opposed to the quantity. We should have, yeah, here we go. So actions spec. We have a spec for our actions file because we have these action creators that are non-trivial, and we're specifying those. For load restaurants, we're specifying just one thing, that it stores restaurants into Redux that were retrieved from the API. And instead of connecting to Redux or redux-thunk at all, because testing those can get kind of complicated, all the confidence that I feel like we need here is covered by just testing the function directly as a plain old function. So we set up some restaurant data. We set up a dispatch jest mock function that we're going to be able to assert against. And then we call load restaurants using the format that redux-thunk specifies. So we have the initial call that gives it any arguments that we need custom from our business logic, which is nothing for load restaurants. And then we call it again the way it's going to be called within the redux-thunk middleware, passing it that dispatch function, which for us is a mock function. Then after that finishes, after that asynchronous command is done, we can expect dispatch to have been called. And we're confirming the action that was actually dispatched. The store restaurants action was dispatched, and that the right data, the restaurants that was returned from the mocked get call, are passed along to Redux. So we're just covering our function here. We're making sure that, assuming we get the right call and the right data coming in from the web service, that the right data goes out dispatched into Redux. For add restaurant, we do things a bit differently. So we set up some fake data here. Before each, we mock the resolve value for the post command, because we're going to be calling a post on the server. And then we call add restaurant. We do have a parameter to pass in now. We have the name of the restaurant entered by the user. And then we dispatch that. So we're checking two things. We're testing two things, and we've set up these tests with one expectation per test. We test that we're sending the new restaurant to the server, and so we check that API post was called, going to the right URL, and sending the right data body. And again, this test doesn't hit the actual Axios API, so we need that not even the end-to-end testing, but we need manual testing to make sure that the real request going out to the server really works, that we're really authenticated with that API key that I've put into a live stream and things like that. We also then test again that the new restaurant data is stored into the state, and we're able to test that the data with a returned ID is actually passed in there and dispatched with the add restaurant action. So I think I've been talking here. I think our automated test will have run, and I think they're actually not going to pass. We'll see if I'm surprised. We did set up Circle CI, as recall. That actually has passed. That's surprising. So that's actually nice because we're going to be able to merge down. So let me think about that, because we haven't done anything to connect our add dishes to connect that to the server. So although our restaurant is being stored on the server and things like that, if we look at our dish actions to add a dish, that's still just being stored locally. Nothing's going up to the server. And that's actually working fine for right now because our tests aren't covering that, requiring the dishes to be there initially loaded from the server or anything like that. And I would love to continue on, but I'm feeling the strain of this stream. This is now coming up on getting close to 3 hours. But just a last chance for questions. I'll take a moment for that. If anybody on the stream right now has any questions or feedback on what you've seen here as far as this PR, I will post the link for the PR on the chat. Here is the PR. So yeah, anyone listening to this right now, if you have any feedback or just want to say hello or tell me where you're from and where you're listening from, and if you are in fact on Thanksgiving break or not in the US, you can feel free to let me know. Just while I'm wrapping up, I'll give you some other notes just while I'm waiting for any possible questions to come in. You can hit me up on React-to-Flux anytime you want. React-to-Flux, let's search for it. React-to-Flux is the official React Discord. There's a lot of Redux stuff in there and React testing. React Native also is officially in there as well. So go to reactoflux.com and sign up. I try to be in the testing channel there and providing answers and thoughts and learning more about what y'all are looking for and what kind of testing you're doing, what problems you're running into, and what experience you've had. So that's really great. You can also hit me up on Twitter. I'm coding it wrong on there. That link should be in the show notes down below the live stream or of the recording to hit me up on there with my hilarious profile pic on there, making jokes about React hooks. It's good times. Okay, so nobody on the live stream has said any comments yet, so I think we'll wrap it up with that. Everyone who's joined, thank you so much. I saw folks coming and going at different times, so I really appreciate y'all coming here and joining in. I hope this has been helpful. I was glad to get through here. We'll see what other live streams that I can fit in before the holidays get started, but I'm glad that we got to a great point. Testing the external interfaces, external APIs is challenging. And so I was glad to be able to share some thoughts. Cypress has some great thoughts here on that network request page about how to do it in Cypress. We looked at it for unit tests as well. So test your applications, try out Cypress, try out React testing library. We didn't get into that very much as a minor note because when we were testing our reducers, that was just, and our action creators, that was just simple JavaScript. That was just plain functions, so we didn't need to reach for any kind of testing libraries. But that worked out really well, I think. So thanks everyone for joining in, and we'll catch you next time in the stream. Let's go to the slide. See ya.